Sharon Tate. Before that name became shorthand for one night in August 1969, it meant something else entirely. In 1967, Hollywood didn't just notice Sharon Tate. Playboy crowned it the year Sharon Tate happens, splashing her across two glossy pages as the heir to Marilyn Monroe, the industry's newest sex symbol. A reporter asked her, point blank, what she made of that label. Her answer ran in print, unedited. I think I'm the most unsexy thing that ever was. Read that twice. Not modesty. Not a publicist's line. A woman, at the absolute peak of her fame, looking straight at the image Hollywood had built around her, and rejecting it, on the record, while the cameras kept rolling and away. The magazines printed her words. Then ran the same headline the following week. This is not the story of the tragedy that made her famous in death. It's the story of the gentle soul Hollywood never printed, told here, finally, in her own words. She did not choose the first stage she ever stood on. She was 6 months old. In the summer of 1943, in Dallas, Texas, someone in her family, her mother, or perhaps her grandmother, the record isn't certain, entered a photograph of the infant Sharon Tate into a contest called Miss Tiny Tot of Dallas. She won. The prize was a $50 savings bond. She would never remember any of it. It happened to her before she had language to understand what was happening to her at all. That is where the public story of Sharon Tate begins, and it's worth noticing what kind of beginning it is. Not an ambition she reached for. A verdict handed down about her face before she had any say in the matter. It kept happening. Miss Richland, Washington, 1959. Queen of the Autorama the same year. The dark-eyed, blonde-haired beauty, the local paper called her, for something she hadn't done. Only been. She held the Miss Richland crown for exactly 1 week. Her father, an Army intelligence officer, was transferred to Italy almost immediately after the ceremony, and the title passed to the runner-up before she'd even finished her victory lap. We really hate to go, he told a reporter, trying to put a good face on it, but that is the way it is in the Army. 16 years old, and she had already learned the lesson that would shape the rest of her career. Nothing she won was hers to keep. The moves never stopped. 6 cities by the time she turned 16. In Washington state, a photograph of her in a swimsuit ran on the cover of Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, posed, almost absurdly, on top of a missile. A teenage girl's body printed for soldiers overseas as decoration on a weapon. No one on record ever asked her how that felt. Then, in Italy, where her father's next posting took the family, a director named Richard Flesher spotted her standing in a crowd of unpaid film extras on the set of Barabbas. He didn't ask her to audition. He simply turned to his assistant and said it out loud, in words he later put into his own memoir. I wanted her in every close shot I could use. She hadn't asked to be seen. She was just standing there. And that, too, became part of the verdict. By the time she was 20, the pattern was already set. People looked at Sharon Tate, decided something about her, and acted on it, without once asking her what she thought she was. In 1962, a 20-year-old Sharon Tate flew to Hollywood to audition. A producer named Martin Ransohoff spotted her almost immediately. His words to her, by his own later account, were blunt. Baby, we're gonna make you a star. She signed a 7-year contract. The machine had found its newest raw material. What followed wasn't a career she built. It was an image built around her. Small television parts. A bank secretary on the Beverly Hillbillies. Modeling work. A role in the strange occult thriller Eye of the Devil, playing a silent young witch named Odile, a performance the New York Times called chillingly beautiful but expressionless. MGM's own press office introduced her as one of the screen's most exciting new personalities. The studio even produced a 40-minute promotional film about her alone, dancing in nightclubs, sightseeing in London, beautiful and almost entirely incidental to its own subject. The actual film failed at the box office. The description of her stuck anyway. Then came Valley of the Dolls in 1967. Critics tore the film itself apart. Newsweek wrote that it had no more sense of its own ludicrousness than a village idiot stumbling in manure. And inside that wreckage, a separate verdict kept surfacing anyway, astoundingly photogenic, infinitely curvaceous. One review called her, naming her one of the most striking new arrivals Hollywood had seen in years. A Golden Globe nomination followed. So did a comparison the press couldn't stop reaching for: Sharon Tate, the new Marilyn Monroe. Nobody paused to ask whether that was a comparison worth wanting. Monroe's own story had not exactly ended somewhere anyone should aspire to. Look magazine ran a double-page spread on her that year. A suntan lotion company put her face on its bottles. A martial artist named Bruce Lee personally trained her for the fight choreography in her next film, The Wrecking Crew, a detail the finished movie never bothered to credit, because crediting her work was never really the point. Being looked at was. By 1968, Hollywood had built her an image to match the role she'd been handed since infancy: photographed, admired, endlessly described, and almost never actually asked anything. That same year, it handed her a co-star to match the image exactly. She met Roman Polanski a year earlier, on the set of The Fearless Vampire Killers, a horror comedy he was directing and starring in alongside her. She was still seeing Jay Sebring at the time, the Hollywood hairstylist she'd dated for nearly 2 years, the man who taught her, in quieter moments, how to cut hair herself. When she and Polanski fell for each other, she ended things with Sebring without acrimony. He stayed in her life anyway, a close friend straight through to the end, in a way few exes manage and even fewer are asked to. The film that brought her and Polanski together was, on release, a disaster. The studio recut it against his wishes. He called the result a butchering. Newsweek agreed, calling it a witless travesty. None of that mattered, in the end, to the two people who had actually made it. By January of 1968, the picture was complete. Sharon Tate married Roman Polanski, fresh off the acclaim of Rosemary's Baby, in a ceremony in London. The photographs from that year show two people who looked like they'd already arrived, a beautiful, gifted, internationally celebrated young couple hosting a circle of friends that read like a list of the decade's most recognizable names. This was the surface fully assembled at last. A former beauty queen from a military family, a girl who'd once gone years without keeping a single close friend, was now, by every visible measure, exactly what the machine had spent a decade promising her she'd become. It is the version of Sharon Tate most people who recognize the name will picture first. The wife, the starlet, the blonde on the magazine cover. It is also, by every account from the people who actually shared a room with her, the smallest part of who she was, and even her own husband seemed to sense it. At a press conference not long after their wedding, surrounded by journalists fixated on her looks, Polanski lost his patience. He didn't dispute what they'd written about her. He challenged what they'd left out. In all that coverage, not one of them, he pointed out, had ever bothered to ask whether she could actually act. Glamour, it turns out, is the easiest thing in the world to perform. The first real crack in Sharon Tate's story wouldn't come from a scandal or a rumor or anything the press went looking for. It would come from her own mouth, and almost no one would notice. On the set of 12+1 in Italy, Sharon Tate introduced herself to her co-star, the British comic actor Terry Thomas, before their first scene together. He remembered exactly what she said: "I can't act, but I somehow get by without anyone realizing, so don't worry." It reads as a joke. Read twice, it sounds like something closer to a confession wearing a joke's clothing, the kind people make when they suspect the thing they're saying might actually be true, and would rather say it themselves before someone else gets the chance. Her family had called her shy and lacking in confidence since childhood. As an adult, she said something that explained exactly what that shyness cost her. People mistook it for aloofness, she said, until they actually got to know her. The cool blonde, the untouchable starlet, that was a misread. Underneath it was a woman bracing for being misunderstood, and disarming it, whenever she could, with a joke aimed at herself first. There's a reason the shyness ran so deep, and it traces back to a detail almost nobody includes in her story. By 16, she'd lived in 6 different cities and, by her own family's account, had genuinely struggled to keep a single friendship long enough for it to matter. It was only in Italy, at an American school in Vicenza full of other military kids who understood exactly what it felt like to always be the new one, that she finally made friends who lasted. The woman the magazines would later call cool and unreachable had simply never been given enough time, as a teenager, to learn how to keep anyone close. A pause here, in my own voice. There's a particular kind of woman who learns to undercut herself before anyone else gets the chance to. It isn't low self-esteem exactly, though it looks like it from the outside. It's armor worn so long it starts to feel like skin. I recognize it. I'd guess a lot of you watching this do too, the reflex to say I'm not that good, really in the same breath as doing something remarkable, just so the ground can't be pulled out from under you later. That same instinct, disarm it before anyone else can use it, shows up again and again in what she said, on the record, about her own beauty. Asked once what she thought her own appeal actually was, she didn't claim it wasn't there. She said only that whatever it wasn't obvious, at least to me. She drew a hard, almost surgical line between 2 words the public used interchangeably about her. Beauty is something you see, she said. Love is something you feel. She was telling people, as plainly as she knew how, that the thing they kept photographing wasn't the thing that actually mattered to her. She turned the same instinct on her own marriage, in a line dry enough that it has outlived almost every formal interview she ever gave. We have a good arrangement. Roman lies to me and I pretend to believe him. No diary survives to explain what was underneath that sentence on the day she said it. No letter tells us whether it was simple marital teasing between 2 people who adored each other, or something with a harder edge delivered lightly enough to pass as a joke. The record doesn't say. So nothing here will pretend to know. What can be stated is only this: she said it, in public, about her own marriage, with no one forcing the words out of her. That much, at least, is unmistakably hers. She turned it on her own talent, too. Asked whether she saw herself tackling something more serious, more classical, she didn't reach for false modesty, she simply said no. I don't fool myself, she told an interviewer. I can't see myself doing Shakespeare. And when she talked about the kind of actress she actually hoped to become, she didn't reach for a sex symbol's name. She reached for Catherine Deneuve, someone, she said, who got to play beautiful, sensitive, deep parts, with intelligence behind them. It was the plainest possible statement of what she wanted from an industry that had no interest in giving it to her. 5 more words, offered without a hint of defensiveness, finish the picture. I guess I'm too outspoken. A trait the era had no real use for in a woman who was supposed to be decorative first, agreeable second, and nothing else at all. But there was one more thing she said, once, to a journalist who happened to collect a very different kind of story, and it would outlive her in ways she never could have intended. In the spring of 1968, on the set of The Wrecking Crew, a columnist named Dick Kleiner sat down with her for an interview that would later run in a small magazine called Fate, devoted to psychic phenomena. He asked, as he reportedly asked most of his subjects, whether she'd ever had a psychic experience. She said yes. She told him plainly, it was a terribly frightening and disturbing thing for me. She described a night about a year earlier, alone overnight in a Benedict Canyon house that had once belonged to her old boyfriend, Jay Sebring, a house with an unhappy history of its own. She'd been startled awake by a presence she couldn't name. What she described after that, a figure, a staircase, an image disturbing enough that she was still talking about it a full year later, has since been picked apart, exaggerated, and eventually turned into the entire premise of a feature film imagining her predicting her own death. Her sister Deborah has pushed back hard against that mythology in the years since. I know for a fact she did not have a premonition, Deborah has said publicly, adding that she checked with every one of Sharon's friends still living, and not one of them had ever heard of any prophecy. What's actually verifiable here is smaller than the legend, and, in its own way, more revealing. A young actress, alone overnight in someone else's house, frightened enough by something she couldn't name that she kept talking about it for a year, to a journalist who happened to collect that kind of story. Not a vision of the future. A record of a woman who got scared sometimes, and was honest enough to say so out loud, even knowing exactly how a story like that could be twisted later. There was a second crack that same year, with no ghost story attached to it at all, just an ordinary, genuinely dangerous accident. Filming the stunt for Don't Make Waves, she was meant to parachute into a swimming pool. The parachute deployed wrong. It came down over the water instead of beside it, and she went under it, trapped beneath the canopy, in real danger, for several long minutes before anyone reached her. It barely made the press. A stunt gone wrong, filed away the way these things were filed away in an industry that asked young actresses to risk a great deal for very little protection in return. A second pause in my own voice. What strikes me about both of these moments, the ghost story and the parachute, is that they happened to her in the ordinary course of simply doing her job, and neither one was treated, at the time, as worth stopping for. I don't think that's unique to Sharon Tate. I think it's something a lot of women recognize, the small, frightening things that happen to you while you're just trying to get through a Tuesday, that nobody else thinks to ask you about afterward. If fear was something she admitted to once and then let go, there was something else entirely that she held on to for the rest of her life, and refused, point blank, to put down. She kept a teddy bear from the age of 3. She never gave it up. She kept boxes, too, by her own account, every single box anyone had ever given her, and refused to part with a single one. If I give them up, she said, I've given in to being a movie star. Sit with that sentence for a second. A teddy bear and a stack of cardboard boxes held onto as an act of resistance, proof, to herself, that the woman on the magazine covers hadn't fully swallowed the girl who still wanted small, ordinary things within reach. She rarely wore makeup off-set. She avoided rings, she said, because she bit her nails and didn't want anyone's eyes drawn there. She wore Vaseline on her lips instead of lipstick. None of it made headlines. None of it was meant to. She had opinions, too, that nobody asked her to perform. On the censorship fights of her era, she pointed out that children could watch people murder each other on television without a flicker of controversy, while 2 adults expressing love triggered outrage. It's silly, she said flatly. She had wanted, as a girl, to become a psychiatrist. Or a ballerina. Stardom, when it crossed her mind at all back then, struck her as the kind of dream too far-fetched to risk wanting. She ended up with the dream nobody had warned her to take seriously, and lost the 2 she might actually have chosen for herself. And there is this, the single most pointed thing she ever said about her own career, dropped almost casually into an interview. Her best remembered role was Jennifer North in Valley of the Dolls, a character whose entire tragedy is being loved for her body and nothing underneath it. Sharon said of playing her, that she felt a kinship with the part. Nobody handed her that insight. She noticed it herself, a character written to be exactly what the world kept insisting she was off-screen, every single day. It is one thing to notice a pattern like that in your own life. It's another thing entirely to have the people who loved you confirm it, in their own words, after it was already too late for it to change anything. Ask the people who actually shared rooms with her, rather than the ones who only photographed her, and a completely different vocabulary appears almost immediately. A friend who had known her for 6 years gave an interview not long before everything changed. She couldn't recall a single instance, in all that time, of Sharon speaking badly of another person, not a co-star, not a rival, not anyone. Sharon, she said, had no defenses, no pretenses, just herself, all the time. In a town built on calculation, she added, that wasn't just rare. It bordered on impossible. Her husband put it more starkly, years later, while grieving. The press and the public knew of her physical beauty, he said, but she also had a beautiful soul, and added that this was something only her friends had ever actually known. In a separate interview that same period, he went further, pushing back against the rumors already growing around her death. They had turned her, he said, into a monster, built out of the sweetest, most innocent human being he had ever known. Kindness itself, he called her, to everybody and everything around her. It is rare to hear a grieving husband correct the public record so plainly, in real time, while the record was still being written around him. It's worth pausing here on how fragile this part of the story actually is. Sharon left no diary that has ever been published. The fullest written accounts of her inner life come secondhand, assembled from her family's unfinished memoirs by other hands after her death, in a book her own sister has publicly disputed for accuracy. Even the people who loved her most don't fully agree, decades later, on how her story should be told. That disagreement is itself part of the truth here. What we have of Sharon Tate is built from fragments, and not every fragment lines up. Fragments, stacked carefully enough, start to form a shape. And the shape that emerges next has almost nothing to do with the woman on any magazine cover. There was no single decisive event that revealed who Sharon Tate actually was underneath the surface. No scandal, no rupture, no headline moment of unmasking. That absence is in its own way the most important fact in this entire section. The truth about her never arrived as a revelation. It accumulated in small testimonies from people who weren't being interviewed for a magazine spread and had no reason to perform anything for anyone. Her sister Deborah later described her as something closer to a second mother than an older sibling, despite the 10 years between them. Friends recalled, almost as an aside, that she preferred a quiet evening at home over the parties her position required her to attend. She'd grown up partly in Italy and said, once, that she felt more at ease there, partly, she explained, because the men she'd known abroad were allowed to be open about their feelings, even allowed to cry, without it costing them anything. That detail almost never makes the documentaries built around her death. It says something, though, about what she actually valued, not glamour, but a kind of emotional permission she didn't feel she had ever where she went. A place where people, men included, didn't have to perform invulnerability just to get through the day. Her sister remembered something smaller still, the particular scent of a bath product called Milk and Pearls, the smell Sharon always carried with her, clean and unmistakably her own. It isn't the kind of detail that survives in any official biography. It survived because someone who loved her simply never let herself forget it. Decades after her death, Deborah assembled a photo book devoted entirely to her sister's life and work, deliberately leaving out the murder, the killers, everything that came after, because, in Deborah's words, that is not the whole of who her sister was. Jack Nicholson, Warren Beatty, Robert Evans, Raquel Welch, Hugh Hefner, people who had actually known her, were asked to set down whatever they remembered. The project itself is a kind of argument that this woman deserves a record built by people who sat in rooms with her, not one built entirely from headlines and crime reports. A third pause in my own voice. I find I keep returning to these tiny and dramatic details: a bath product, a refusal to wear rings, a scent a sister still remembers more than 50 years later, far more than I return to any of the photographs. The photographs were taken of her. These details were noticed by people who actually loved her. That is a different kind of attention altogether, and a much rarer one. By 1968 and into 1969, something in her priorities had visibly shifted, and this time, the shift was hers. Not handed to her by a producer, a pageant judge, or a press release. She told interviewers more than once that she intended to step back from acting altogether. Not because the work had failed her. Her comedic performances in The Wrecking Crew and Don't Make Waves had drawn some of the warmest reviews of her career, with critics noting a lightness and timing the more serious films had never given her room to show. Decades later, the film historian Leonard Maltin would go back and single out those same two performances as the clearest evidence of the career she might actually have had, not the sex symbol parts, but the comic ones, the parts that let her be quick and funny instead of simply photographed. She'd said early on exactly what she wanted instead, to find her own niche in comedy, to become a light comedian in the Carole Lombard style. A specific, considered ambition. Not a vague wish for fame. She wanted to walk away from it anyway. She told people plainly that she wanted to be a full-time mother instead. This is worth sitting with, because it runs against the shape of almost every story told about ambitious young actresses in that decade. She wasn't pushed out of Hollywood by failure. She appears to have been walking, with apparent clarity, toward something else entirely, on her own schedule, at the exact moment everything stopped. She chose her next film, The 13 Chairs, largely for the chance to work alongside Orson Welles, a decision made for craft, not exposure. She flew to Italy to shoot it while pregnant, working through her final months before the birth. Those around her described the decision the same way, calm, deliberate, made with no hint of urgency. Not a woman fleeing anything. A woman moving toward a life she'd actually picked for herself, for once, without anyone's permission. In February of 1969, she and Polanski moved into a rented house at 10,050 Cielo Drive, in Benedict Canyon. Previously the home of the music producer Terry Melcher and the actress Candice Spurgeon. They'd visited it more than once before it became available, and when it finally did, she was thrilled. She had a name for it, one she used herself, unprompted, her love house. The photographs from that spring tell a story almost nobody associates with her name anymore. In London, between filming commitments, the photographer Terry O'Neill caught her in casual, domestic scenes around their flat, opening baby gifts, laughing, unguarded in a way the studio portraits never let her be. She sat for a separate, more glamorous shoot for the British magazine Queen in the same stretch of weeks. Two versions of her, captured days apart, the public face and the woman underneath it, opening small parcels meant for a child who hadn't been born yet. She came home to Los Angeles on July 20, 1969, crossing the Atlantic by ship. That same evening, she sat with her parents and her sisters and watched, together, as a man walked on the moon. It would be the last time the entire family was together in one room. Polanski stayed behind in London, finishing his own work, expecting to return in time for the birth. He asked two of their house guests, her friends Wojciech Frakowski and Abigail Folger, to stay with her at Cielo Drive until he came back. She had less than 3 weeks left to live. She did not know that. No one did. She was 8.5 months pregnant that summer. Everyone who saw her in those final weeks described the same thing, a woman heavy, slow, and simply ready. She wanted Roman home. He'd told her August 12th. She confided to at least one friend, plainly, that the delay disappointed her. There's no cruelty in that detail, and no foreboding either, whatever later films have tried to make of it. It is simply a pregnant woman, alone in a house she loved, wanting her husband back before the baby came. She kept busy in small ways. She talked on the phone constantly, to Roman, to friends, to her family. Her sister Deborah called that final week about a saddle Sharon had picked up for her in Europe. An ordinary, sisterly errand. The kind of call that means absolutely nothing, and then, depending entirely on which day it falls, means everything. She was, by then, a woman her family loved having close. Her father would later leave the military entirely, chasing every possible answer about what happened to her. Her mother would spend the rest of her own life fighting, in courtrooms, at parole hearings, and eventually through a victims' rights organization she founded herself, on her daughter's behalf. None of that had happened yet. In August of 1969, she was simply the oldest daughter, recently home from London, sitting in her parents' living room 2.5 weeks earlier to watch a man walk on the moon, already planning to see her family again soon. The record, where it exists at all in her own words from this period, is almost entirely domestic. A baby. A husband. A date circled on a calendar. Nothing in it suggests a woman bracing for anything at all. On the afternoon of August 8, 1969, two friends came for lunch, the actress Joanna Patet and the singer Barbara Lewis. They arrived around noon. The housekeeper, Winnie Chapman, served the meal. According to everyone in that room, the conversation stayed on one subject almost the entire time, what one of them later called, simply, baby shop talk. Cribs. Names. The ordinary, repetitive, happy talk of women waiting for a birth none of them yet knew wouldn't happen. Frykowski and Folger joined partway through. The group stayed together into the afternoon. At some point, worn down by the pregnancy, Sharon went to lie down and rest. She spoke to Roman by phone that day. She spoke to her sister about the saddle. This is the last clearly documented day of her life. Notice what it's actually made of: a meal with friends, talk about a baby who hadn't arrived yet, a nap because she was tired, two ordinary phone calls to people she loved. Nothing in it asks to be remembered. It was simply a Friday. That night, she and four other people, Sebring, Folger, Frykowski, and a young man named Stephen Parent, who had only stopped by to visit the property's caretaker, were killed in the house she had called her love house by members of a group that would become known as the Manson family. She did not survive to see her son born. This script will not describe what happened to her inside that house. Not out of squeamishness, but out of the exact principle that has guided every section before this one. She does not get to speak for herself about what came next, so nothing will be invented to speak for her instead. There is no verified record of her final words. None of what's been attributed to her in that last hour, in tabloids, in true crime retellings, in films that have imagined her fighting, pleading, predicting, actually comes from her. It comes from people writing about her afterward. The silence here is real. It will be left standing. What we do have, instead, is the day before. The lunch. The baby talk. The nap. A phone call to a husband she missed, and another to a sister about a saddle. If there's a final truth to leave her with, it may be only this: the last verified words anyone ever recorded from Sharon Tate weren't about fear, or fate, or any of the things later made of her death. They were about a piece of writing equipment, bought for someone she loved, in a country she'd once felt at home in, on an ordinary afternoon when she still believed she had all the time in the world. One last pause, in my own voice. I went looking for her the way I always go looking for the women in these stories, expecting to find a tragedy wearing a face. What I found instead was a woman who kept a childhood teddy bear because she refused to let stardom take the ordinary parts of her away. A woman who made jokes about her own talent before anyone else could get there first. A woman who said, plainly, that she didn't feel sexy in the 1 year an entire industry insisted she was nothing else. She doesn't need rescuing from what happened to her. She already told us who she was the whole time, in her own words. We just had to be willing, finally, to listen. This is where her story ends. Not at the tragedy everyone remembers. At the saddle. At the nap. At a woman, tired and pregnant and looking forward to Tuesday, who for one more afternoon was simply, fully herself, unphotographed, unwatched, and entirely her own.